In the heart of a mansion where luxury shone brighter than the stars, a young black maid walked through the hallways, carrying not only trays, but also the weight of the contempt she received daily. Her blonde, dazzling and cold employer turned every small detail into an opportunity to humiliate, as if the employee's pain were a private spectacle. Laughter echoed, harsh orders fell like whips, and the young woman's dignity seemed to vanish beneath gazes that treated her as if invisible. But behind the employer's haughty gestures and the millionaire's silence, something was about to be born. Because when his heart began to beat differently in front of the one everyone despised, fate began to write a story that neither wealth nor vanity could prevent. The gala evening became the stage for the greatest humiliation. In front of influential guests, the mistress exposed the maid in a cruel joke, as if it were fun to make her a target. The scornful looks burned more than words, and the young woman swallowed her tears, lowering her head. But in that moment, the millionaire, accustomed to silence, couldn't look away. There was something about her, steadiness amidst pain, dignity amidst shame, that disarmed him more than any flashy beauty. And while his wife celebrated her victory, he already knew he was about to undertake the greatest challenge of his life, confronting not only the lie of his own home, but also the forbidden desire growing within him. What came next would forever change the fate of everyone in that mansion. If this story has touched you so far, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. The mansion stood like a palace in the middle of a neighborhood where wealth was synonymous with power. Immense chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting off marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, and every detail seemed designed to reaffirm the grandeur of the family who lived there. To those who entered, the house was perfect, but behind closed doors, perfection hid wounds. At the heart of this luxurious machinery was a young black maid who walked silently through the hallways, carrying trays and cleaning unseen corners. Her simple uniform marked her as part of the service, but her straight posture and firm gaze showed that not even humiliation could strip her of her dignity. Still, the pain she felt had no witnesses, except the pillows wet with silent tears. The boss, blonde, tall, and strikingly beautiful, paraded through the rooms as if she were an absolute queen. Her presence dominated the space, and her voice, charged with authority, sounded like a sentence to anyone who dared to err. To her, the maid was little more than an object, useful when she obeyed, disposable when she erred. All it took was a poorly folded tablecloth, a plate delivered seconds too late, and the humiliation came in public, in sharp words, accompanied by knowing giggles from the friends who were always nearby. The boss delighted in belittling the other, as if each insult were further proof of her superiority. The millionaire husband of the stunning blonde seemed oblivious to what was happening around him. He spent his days amidst meetings, contracts, and figures that piled up like milestones of his success. He sat at the head of the table, oblivious to the hidden tears of the waitress serving the dishes. To him, she was invisible, a presence that went unnoticed in the background of his luxurious life. But sometimes his eyes would involuntarily wander to her, lingering a little longer than they should, as if something in her silent, firm posture intrigued him without him having the courage to admit it. The couple's young son was perhaps the only ray of light in the maid's routine. He followed her through the hallways, seeking comfort in her presence, laughing at stories she made up to distract him. While adults despised her, the child saw her as a safe haven, and this innocent bond planted seeds of affection that only increased the employer's resentment. For the mother, every smile her son gave the maid was like a thorn in her vanity. Thus the stage was formed. On one side, the blonde and arrogant boss, mistress of everything and everyone. On the other, the black maid, invisible to some, uncomfortable to others, but possessing a silent strength that not even humiliation could erase. In the center, the millionaire, still hidden behind silence, unaware that it would be precisely this silence that would soon begin to crumble. Fate, patient and relentless, was already setting the wheels in motion. Because in a house where appearances were worth more than truths, the greatest twist was about to unfold. something no one dared expect. The millionaire's own heart, secretly, was already turning to the one everyone was trying to erase. Mornings at the mansion were like small displays of ostentation. The breakfast table was always set with exotic fruits, fresh-cut flowers, and imported porcelain. Every detail seemed more important than the people sitting there. The maid, as always, arrived before everyone else, arranged each piece in its proper place, and remained standing, invisible, awaiting orders. It was on one of these mornings that the first public humiliation occurred in front of everyone. The mistress descended the stairs dressed in blue silk, her blonde hair impeccable and her eyes sharp as knives. She approached the table, examined the arrangement, and found a tiny detail. A teaspoon aligned a centimeter out of place. She smiled sideways and raised her voice, drawing the attention of those present. "Is it really that difficult to learn something so simple?" she asked, pointing directly at the maid. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the quiet laughter of a friend of the mistress, who was enjoying her coffee. The maid lowered her eyes and took a deep breath without responding, knowing that any word would only fuel further humiliation. The millionaire, sitting at the head of the table, leafed through the newspaper as if nothing had happened. But behind the pages, his eyes flickered up, resting for a few seconds on the scene. He said nothing, and this silence seemed to legitimize his wife's contempt. Still, deep inside him, something stirred, a discordant note in his perfect routine. He had seen in the maid's eyes a flash of restrained pain, a gesture of dignity that refused to yield. It wasn't just submission, it was silent resistance. Days later, during a formal luncheon, the scene repeated itself with even more intensity. The mistress, in front of important guests, deliberately dropped a napkin on the floor. She ordered the maid to pick it up right there, in front of everyone. When the young woman bent down, the mistress laughed sarcastically and commented aloud, "That's what they're for, isn't it? To remind us not to make mistakes." This was met with malicious giggles around the table. The maid felt her heart tighten, but held back a tear. The millionaire, however, watched from the corner of his eye, uncomfortable, not yet daring to intervene. His jaw tightened, his hand gripping the glass tightly, as if he were fighting with himself. That same night, while collecting glasses in the empty ballroom after another event, the maid heard footsteps. The millionaire entered silently, as if he didn't want to be noticed. For a moment, their eyes met. She quickly lowered her head, but he didn't look away, so quickly. There was more in his gaze than simple curiosity. It was a silent recognition, as if he saw what everyone else refused to see. He said nothing, simply walked past her and up the stairs. But for both of them, that moment remained. The employer, however, did not fail to notice the invisible sparks. She sensed her husband's discomfort and also sensed the silent strength of her maid, who would not be easily destroyed. And, driven by a jealousy she could not yet name, she began to plot even greater humiliations, as if to crush any shred of dignity the young woman possessed. It was only the beginning. Every cruel look from his mistress became a wound, but every silence from the millionaire, however cowardly, held the seeds of something deeper. The wheel of destiny was already turning, and not even his wife's arrogance could stop it. The boy began searching for her like someone who finds a piece of home where no one ever lingers. In the mornings, she would appear in the pantry with her sneaker laces tangled and a rush in her eyes. She would bend down, slowly show him the path the string takes until it becomes a loop, tie it once, and the second time, let his hands guide her. "That way, it won't let go," he would repeat, focused, and run off only to return a moment later and ask her to watch again. In the afternoons, when his mistress left for appointments, and the silence of the marble seemed too loud, the boy would appear with a broken toy car, a picture book, a small fear he couldn't name. She would fix wheels with rubber bands and tape, turn pages pointing out whales and stars, place the juice cup in his palm, and say that certain pains go away when the chest learns to breathe at the right rhythm. In those moments, a soft light which the house didn't understand took up residence on the child's face. And it was this light that lit up within the boss the discomfort of wearing high heels. The first explicit prohibitions came. Don't accept anything from her. she ordered in front of two friends without hiding her expression. "You don't need people like that around." The boy bit his lip, as if memorizing the exact spot where the word hurt. That same night, he woke from a nightmare and called out a name his mother couldn't bear to hear. The housekeeper hesitated for a second, then called the maid with a small gesture as if choosing to be on the right side of the world. She entered with cloud-like steps, sat on the edge of the bed, counted numbers, backwards as if slowly absorbing fear, and the boy fell asleep with his head resting on her apron. When he looked up, the millionaire was in the doorway, maskless, holding his silence so he wouldn't fall to the floor. "Thank you," he didn't say. He just nodded, and the gesture hovered between them like an agreement for which there were still no words. The next day, the employer redoubled the siege. She removed the maid from the common areas, rearranged schedules so she wouldn't cross the child's path, and supervised tasks with a venomous attention. Even so, the boy found shortcuts. She left drawings in the pantry, 3 figures holding hands, one in an apron with a heart in the pocket, and hid a smooth pebble for good luck in the drawer where she kept dish towels. She kept each piece of paper as if collecting proof that tenderness is also a form of resistance. When the boy fell in the garden and cut his knee, the employer screamed for a random employee, but the child ran, sobbing, straight into the arms that knew the right time to embrace. The blonde woman approached with a laugh that pretended to be superior and sounded like iron. "Don't encourage weakness." The waitress took a second breath before answering. She didn't answer. He washed the wound with the delicacy of someone who is sorting through memories, applied a bandage with a star design, and taught that courage isn't about not crying, it's about knowing when to stop crying. The millionaire began to notice changes in the invisible maps of the house. His son ate better when his plate was colored, the way the young woman prepared for the team, fell asleep faster when the lamplight was at the intensity only she could achieve, stopped fearing the shadows in the hallway when her voice told him there were shadows that only exist with open eyes. The mistress, sensing the movement she wasn't controlling, raised her tone and volume, prohibitions, rules, inventories. In public, she played the attentive mother. In private, she disgustedly collected the drawings the boy insisted on making. One afternoon, he tore one off the counter, slowly crumpled it, and threw it in the trash, unaware that on the other side of the door, someone was watching the scene with their hands clasped in their jacket pocket. The millionaire waited until the kitchen was empty, then uncrumpled the paper and tucked it into his wallet as if rescuing an essential document. That week, the maid began crossing the garden at unlikely times just to return the boy's handshake, from a distance a slight wave that meant, "I'm here." And even when she couldn't get close, she left a napkin on the stone bench with a phrase that belonged in his childhood and in the ruins of his adults. "Courage remembers how to breathe." The boy lip-read it and memorized it, like someone learning the way home. The mistress, sniffing the invisible thread that connected them, promised herself she would cut it at the root. What I hadn't imagined was that certain roots, when buried in the right place, penetrate marble. And it was precisely there where luxury believed it hid everything, that the first crack opened, small, silent, enough to let through the water that breaks down dams. The mansion had never gleamed so brightly. From the iron gate to the inner rooms, everything had been prepared to impress. Red carpets, imported flower arrangements, musicians tuning violins, waiters parading with glittering trays. It was the gala night of the season, the event where the mistress displayed not only her fortune but also her social power. Dressed in gold, with stones that sparkled under every flash, she moved through the room as if she owned the world. Beside her, the millionaire maintained his usual cool demeanor, greeting allies while the guests toasted her return. The maid, in a clean, discreet uniform, moved between the tables carrying glasses. She tried to disappear into the glow, but her steps were firm, and her presence, no matter how much she tried, could not go unnoticed. The boy seated at the head table smiled every time he saw her pass. This detail, small to many, burned the mistress inside like a hot iron. The chosen moment came when the conversations were at their peak and the music had softened. The mistress raised her champagne flute and tapped it gently with her spoon, drawing everyone's attention. The room fell silent. The lights reflected on her earrings, and she smiled a false smile, the kind that hides venom behind its shine. "Dear friends," she began, "in a house like this every detail matters, and that's why every mistake is also impossible to ignore." Eyes followed the direction of her hand, which turned to the maid in the corner of the room. The young woman, uncomprehending, paused for a moment with the tray in her hands. The boss continued, "Just imagine, after so much investment, after so much effort, having to live with carelessness." She chuckled to herself, as if it were a joke. Some guests joined in with discreet chuckles, others simply lowered their eyes, embarrassed. The waitress felt her cheeks heat, but didn't look away. She clutched the tray to her body, maintaining what dignity she had left. To seal the scene, the mistress deliberately dropped a glass on the floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces on the white marble, and the entire room turned toward the sound. "Just look," she said, laughing mischievously. "Even what is perfect can be ruined when you don't know how to take care of things." It was a sentence disguised as a joke, a blow that pretended to be light but weighed like lead. The maid knelt to pick up the pieces. Her hands trembled, but she kept her eyes dry, having learned that tears in public were food for tormentors. But that night one detail changed everything. As she picked up the pieces, the millionaire couldn't look away. He observed the cruel contrast between the glitter of the party and the silent humiliation on the floor. The clenched jaw betrayed a fury he hadn't yet let out, but which already burned within. The boy, unable to contain himself, rose from his chair and ran to her. "I'll help you," he said, kneeling beside her. The simple gesture made the entire room hold its breath. The mistress, red with rage, rushed to snatch her son away, but the damage was done. The image of the child choosing to stand beside the maid instead of his mother, adorned in gold, echoed like a direct blow. The guests exchanged glances, some murmured softly, and the millionaire, though quiet, felt the moment had left a lasting mark on him. He could no longer ignore it. In that moment, faced with the shards of glass scattered across the floor, he began to see how much his house was built on shards of lies and vanity. The next morning dawned with a rehearsed silence, the kind that precedes scenes repeated 1,000 times in the minds of those who stage them. The mistress crossed the closet like an actress who knows exactly where the light favors her and suddenly let out a calculated scream that spread through the corridors like a fire alarm. An irretrievable jewel, a family gift, had disappeared from the safe. Within minutes, security guards took up positions. The housekeeper was hurriedly summoned. Employees interrupted tasks, and the millionaire descended the stairs with the cold face he uses to close difficult contracts. The main room transformed into a courtroom. The mistress, pale, just right, shaking her hands just right, breathing just right, announced that someone with enhanced access had betrayed the house's trust. Her eyes, guided by an invisible force, converged on the black maid, who was standing in the distance drying glasses, as always, in the place where dignity usually waits without an audience. She lowered the cloth slowly, as if guarding her breath so that nothing falls, and stared at the void between herself and everyone else. That space where the words of the humble usually don't reach. The search began, but not where logic dictated. Not in the safe, not in the closet, not in the intimate corridors. The search continued first to the utility room, a drawer with 2 uniforms folded into impeccable rectangles, a pair of worn shoes on the toes, a rosary of blue beads, an old family photo protected by plastic that was already yellowing at the edges. Nothing. They went down to the pantry, a closet of linens, detergent, a notebook with hand-copied recipes. Nothing. The mistress then glanced at the pantry, and time, which until then had been moving forward in fits and starts, suddenly took its course. With a "leave it to me" that took the air from the room, she stepped between the shelves, took the exact time it took to sigh, and reappeared holding aloft the lost jewel, sparkling like evidence fallen from the sky. The room held its breath, first out of reflex, then out of shame. "I was here, hidden among the supplies," she proclaimed, and the word Hidden ran like a sentence, sticking to the body of the one person who had nowhere to hide anything but herself. The maid lifted her chin an inch, enough to keep it from falling. "I didn't touch that." The sentence came out simple, without flourish, truly heavy. The mistress smiled with the sweetness that cuts through. "The house is big. The mistake, too." The millionaire, until then made of stone, moved his fingers on the arm of the chair. His jaw betrayed, contained anger, but the mask of years still kept him seated. The son, who had been watching the scene with clenched fists, escaped from the chair and ran to the maid. He clung to her apron with the urgency of someone who recognizes a port on a stormy day. "She didn't do anything," he said, and his small voice pierced the glass like a hammer. The mistress pulled the boy away with cruel gentleness, whispering that children don't understand trust. The head of security cleared his throat. The housekeeper clutched the dish towel until her knuckles turned white. Two waiters exchanged the kind of look only those who sweep up secrets learn to speak. Then came the euphemisms born to hurt quietly. Preventive removal from social areas, review of protocols, readjustment of schedules. With each polite word, one less step on the ground for someone already living on the edge. The maid didn't cry. She breathed backward, a trick she'd taught the boy to combat nightmares, and responded with just her whole body. She stood. She placed the glass on the tray, as if returning to the world what it insists on dropping, and waited. The millionaire rose half a step, and in that half step there was the difference between cowardice and courage. He didn't go. The house, however, recorded the tremor. At the top of the stairs, a discreet camera flashed its usual thin red. No one sees, fate sees. When the room emptied, all that remained was the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the rust of injustice. The mistress received pitying glances that she mistook for support, waved to her friends who were already mentally composing their generous version for the week's brunches, and disappeared down the private hallway with the lightness of someone who believes she's won once again. The housekeeper accompanied the maid to the pantry in silence, leaving a glass of water on the counter and a tiny note under the saucer. "I saw." The girl ran her hand over the paper as if touching an amulet, and, before night fell, went to the pantry alone. She stood for a few seconds before the shelf where the jewel had appeared. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood and silently prayed that the truth not be hidden from her own name. In his office, the millionaire stood before the glass, seeing in his reflection the man he was and what he would become when he stopped hiding behind silence. The scenes replayed in his head like a rewound tape. His wife's theatrical pause, the all-too-easy find, the boy kneeling among the shards, the small sentence that weighed more than the marble table. For the first time, the arithmetic of his life didn't add up. He asked the head of security for a routine report on access to the pantry and the safe, jotted down times on a pad, and drew lines between gaps. No heroics yet, just the nagging realization that there were too many holes in a story that claimed to be perfect. That night, the rumor spread through the gates like the scent of a party, stuck to the fabric of those who think they're important. The town was beginning to rehearse the shame of others, and the mistress savored the newly born plot. The maid, in the narrow room of the boarding house, took the boy's string medal from her pocket and attached it to the nail on the wall above the bed. She didn't ask for justice, she asked for respite, and she slept with the obstinacy of those who know that some truths take time, but they arrive. The mansion turned off its lights, except for one. In the hallway, connecting the pantry to the kitchen, the red dot of the camera still blinked. Karma, a former resident of houses like that, found a chair and sat in the front row. The millionaire's office was transformed into an interrogation room. His boss, seated in a leather armchair, displayed the recovered jewel as if it were a trophy. The security chief stood nearby, embarrassed, while the maid stood at the desk, her hands trembling, trying to hide the pain of being there. The silence was heavy, until the boss in a calm, sharp voice began her spectacle. "We don't need a scandal. Admit what you did and it's all over." On the table, a piece of paper was already prepared, a printed confession statement with blank lines for signature. The millionaire, standing behind his wife, said nothing, but his rigid jaw betrayed growing discomfort. His mistress pushed the paper forward, offering the pen as if delivering a sentence. "Sign. Be reasonable." The young woman took a deep breath, stifled her tears, and replied with unexpected firmness, "I didn't touch that jewel." The security chief tried to intervene with rapid-fire questions, timetables, and schedules, as if he could force her into error. The employer repeated insinuations. "You have access to the pantry. Who else could?" With each accusation, the employee reaffirmed her innocence. She didn't scream, didn't plead, just repeated the same truth. "It wasn't me." The millionaire watched in silence, and the more he saw the conviction in her eyes, the more he felt the weight of her own silence crush him. Hours later, exhausted, the maid returned to the service room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and finally cried. The tears fell heavily, muffled against the pillow so they wouldn't be heard. She wept not because of the accusation itself, but because of the feeling of being alone in a world determined to blame her. Amidst her despair, she found a small envelope discreetly left on the dresser. Inside was a simple note written by the housekeeper. "I saw you, don't give up." Her hands trembled as she read it. She clutched the paper to her chest like someone holding an anchor in a storm. That night, the boy appeared at her bedroom door, his eyes swollen from crying. He held the string medal she had given him earlier. "Courage remembers how to breathe," he repeated the phrase he had learned from her. The young woman smiled through her tears, took the medal, and tied it around her wrist like a bracelet. She hugged the boy tightly, feeling in him the only certainty she had left. She was not completely alone. Meanwhile, the millionaire locked himself in his office, mentally reviewing every detail. His wife's speech seemed too rehearsed, the finding of the jewel too easy, the accusation too convenient. He asked the security chief for the access reports to the pantry and noticed something disturbing: gaps in the records, erased minutes, cameras that skipped times. For the first time, the perfection of his wife's narrative began to crack before his eyes. The maid lying down clutched the medal on her wrist and whispered that she wouldn't confess to what she hadn't done. Tears dried, his chest still ached, but a small flame was being born amidst the ashes, the flame of resistance. He knew the lie had been planted, but he also knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. Fate, patient, was already moving its pieces. Outside, the dark hallway kept the discreet red light of the camera on. A silent, but faithful witness who would soon have much to say. The next few hours felt like sand between the minutes. The millionaire walked through the house with the uncomfortable sensation that he was walking on ground he himself had built and yet still didn't know. The scent of freshly changed flowers barely covered the rust of injustice. In his office, he spread the access reports on the table like cards from a rigged deck. Entry and exit times, lights on and off, empty hallways that suddenly skipped a few minutes as if time itself had tripped. His wife's perfect narrative was beginning to fray at the edges, and the more he sought his usual coolness to analyze facts, the more the image of the maid standing before him, repeating, "I didn't touch that jewel," insisted on returning with a clarity no number could deny. She called the head of security in a low voice, the one that brooks no excuses. The man arrived with clammy hands and a flash drive in his pocket, saying that some cameras were undergoing maintenance. He asked her to sit down. It wasn't a suggestion. He opened the file, watched banal excerpts, and then suddenly a cut. Repeated. Another cut. 8 minutes swallowed up between the night before and the morning of the discovery. The millionaire took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair as if taking a step back to see the whole picture. The emptiness of the images said more than any technical explanation. Meanwhile, in the windows, the reflection of the garden revealed the silhouette of a man who no longer recognized himself. In that silence he always mistook for prudence. In the hallway, he passed the housekeeper. She lowered her eyes out of habit, but the gesture didn't mask the damp sheen that was beginning to betray both fatigue and courage. "Did the boy sleep?" he asked, as if searching for a neutral topic to say what he couldn't. "He sleeps better when he hears someone counting backwards," she replied, and the code was understood. There was enough tenderness in a house with too much gold and too little light. He returned to his office, the sentence hammering home. The whole house seemed to speak, and what he said no longer matched the version his wife repeated at lunch. The next morning, the boss acted normal with the confidence of someone who believes she's won. Phone calls over glasses, calibrated smiles, the occasional dig about team professionalism. The millionaire listened without hearing. His face remained marble, but inside, doubt had stopped being a whisper and now filled an entire room. He picked up his cell phone, opened the photo gallery, and by reflex found an old image of the enormous ring his wife displayed at every event. He remembered the cold glint of the same ring passing too quickly through a corner of the screen in the pantry video. The fit was instantaneous, like a key in a lock. His body felt it. His jaw clenched, his stomach burned, his skin crawled without feeling cold. That was it. Or almost that. What was missing was the gesture that transforms intimate certainty into the world. That afternoon, he found his son standing before the pantry shelf, arranging a pencil-drawn note, 3 figures holding hands, and, in the apron pocket, a heart. The boy carefully straightened the paper as if straightening a flag. When will she be back? The question came cleanly, without blackmail. His father swallowed the answer he didn't have. Instead, he bent down, tied the laces of his little sneaker, the knots the maid had taught him, and said, almost a secret, "Courage is remembering how to breathe." The boy smiled in the simple way the mansion stubbornly refused to learn. When he stood, the millionaire felt that in that gesture he had chosen a side. Not yet said aloud, but chosen. He returned to the images. He paused frames, noted times, scribbled arrows. The timeline showed a dawn with a light on in the pantry when no one should have been there, coinciding with the interval in which his wife had disappeared from the salon to take a call. The word call sounded hollow, hanging from the ceiling like a false chandelier. He called 2 trusted advisors under the pretext of reviewing risk protocols. He showed only what was needed: gaps, inconsistencies, broken procedures. He observed their reactions. One of them cleared his throat, another preferred the functional silence of those who smell a storm. He didn't mention his wife, not yet, but he planted, with precision, the seed of distrust where he needed it to germinate when the whole truth arrived. As night fell, the boss descended the stairs wearing a metallic dress, ready for a dinner that would replenish the display of her own importance. She threw in a sentence she intended to cut. "I hope the team understood the lesson." He merely nodded, trying to keep his anger from catching fire in the wrong place. He crossed the lobby, stopped beneath the chandelier that reflected the world upside down, and, for the first time in a long time, faced the discreet hallway camera head-on. "I want everything. Uncut," she said into the intercom, her voice low and definitive. On the other end, the head of security responded with a "Yes, sir," with the weight of someone who knows the tide has turned. In the service room, the maid sat on the edge of the bed and felt, for a moment, a thin strand of air enter her. It wasn't peace, it was an omen. Her mistress's footsteps sounded distant, even though they were close, and the city's rumors seemed to finally bring a wind that wasn't scented with lies. She fastened the string medal to her wrist, wiped her face, and returned to her shift, because dignity, she learned, isn't a pose, it's a task. When the house fell asleep, the millionaire stood before the window, his glass of water forgotten on the table, his briefcase open as if opening his chest. It was no longer possible to be 2 men, the one who signed contracts with a firm hand and the one who, for fear of breaking a glass, let an entire life shatter. Doubt had become conflict, and conflict decision. The next step would have light, an audience, and consequences. And even if courage came late, it was finally she who climbed the stairs inside him. Tomorrow he would say what the cameras couldn't say. Tomorrow he would place the weight of his surname on the right side of things. And as the clock ticked, the red light in the hallway blinked as if confirming his presence. Fate, patient, as ever, noted the time. The mansion's walls were no longer enough to satisfy the mistress's vanity. The scandal, instead of being buried, was transformed into social currency. At every charity luncheon, every tea at the club, every dinner among marble columns, she served the same story as the main course. "It's sad, but I had to intervene. You know, Some people don't know how to behave in places like this. She didn't need to name names. Her intonation, her calculated look, and her vague description were enough for everyone to understand who she was referring to. The rumor spread through the city like cheap perfume, quick, invasive, leaving trails. At the market, suspicious glances followed her as she bought bread. On the bus, conversations were interrupted as soon as she boarded, as if her presence carried a charge already judged. The previously friendly landlady began responding with short sentences, implying she didn't want any trouble under her roof. It was as if the maid lived inside an invisible court, condemned without the right to defend herself. And still she wouldn't give in. She returned to the mansion every day, performing her tasks with the same precision as always, lifting dishes, lining towels, cleaning hallways. Each gesture was a form of resistance, a silent cry against the lie that tried to crush her. But in the narrow room, at night, the tears finally found space. She wept, not from guilt, because she was innocent, but from exhaustion, from loneliness, from feeling small before a world that seemed to have already decided her fate. On the other side, the millionaire was beginning to feel the impact of the rumors firsthand. Business partners made veiled comments about a lack of domestic control. A columnist insinuated that even great fortunes hide shame behind closed doors. He read it all in silence, but each line was like an arrow, not only because of the repercussions, but because he knew it was sustained by a lie he himself had allowed to survive. The son, more than anyone, suffered the most. He refused to eat, no longer smiled in the hallways, and spent hours holding drawings in his hands, always the same figures of 3 people holding hands. When someone tried to snatch the paper from him, he cried with a rare fury, "I didn't want new toys or expensive treats. I wanted the presence of the woman who nursed him back from a fall and taught him how to breathe when fear struck." This emptiness began to corrode the mansion, more than any outside rumor. The housekeeper, sensing the growing pain, found ways to sustain small sparks of hope. She left a cup of tea in the maid's room with a hidden note. "I believe." She kept the napkins the boy had scribbled on and discreetly returned them to the young woman. They were small gestures, but to her they were worth more than gold. Meanwhile, the boss believed she was at the height of her victory. The more people commented, the more secure she felt, as if she had shielded herself from suspicion. But she didn't realize that the lie, so zealously repeated, was beginning to erode on its own. In the eyes of some of the more attentive guests, there were already shadows of doubt, and in her own husband's eyes, there was a contained fire that grew stronger with each passing day. The millionaire, increasingly tormented by contradictions, knew he could no longer maintain his silence. Doubt had already turned into a deep conviction. His wife was lying. And if the lie was hers, her omission was now what made him an accomplice. For the first time, he decided it was no longer enough to observe. He needed to act. The mansion, accustomed to serving as a stage for vanity, was about to become a courtroom, and this time the silent cameras would have much more to say than any rehearsed words. The boy began collecting absences like someone collecting seashells at the seashore. At coffee time, he would push his plate away and trace, with his finger in the steam of the cup, 3 figures holding hands. In the pocket of his apron, always a heart. When his mistress saw it, she would rip off the napkin and throw it in the trash with a steely smile. When his father saw it, he would tuck the folded paper into his wallet, like someone hiding a passport. At night, the boy would line up a plastic boat and his string medal of courage on the bedroom floor, press his ear to the edge of the bed, and whisper the numbers backward, the ritual she had taught him, so that fear would forget its way. He sometimes slept with the window ajar. "So the truth can come in," he would say softly, and the phrase, "so young," would drift through the hallways like a breeze that doesn't ask permission. One afternoon, the boy disappeared from the housekeeper's sight for a few minutes. They found him standing in front of the pantry, the very spot where the jewel had appeared. He placed the medal on top of the empty shelf, lifted his chin with the solemnity only childhood knows, and murmured, "To find the truth." The millionaire watched the scene from a distance, and felt his stomach tighten, as if an invisible string were pulling his chest toward what he had always avoided. The image stayed with him like a splinter, his son offering courage to the very spot where the lie had been planted. That night, when the little boy fell asleep, he opened the drawer and found, in the same hiding place as the socks, 2 more crumpled drawings. The woman in an apron in the corner of the room, the boy beside her, and a blue dot in the pocket, the color of the sapphire the whole town was talking about. "Because it shines from within," the boy had explained hours earlier, with a simplicity no gossip column can match. In the following days, the house began to speak in minimal signs. The boy only ate when the plate was colored, as she did for the team. He only slept when the lamplight was dimmed to a moonlight tone that his mistress found tacky. He only crossed the dark hallway if someone counted with him in a low voice from 10 to 0. The millionaire from afar began repeating what he had only half learned. He dimmed the lights, prepared the plate with colors, whispered numbers, and unintentionally opened cracks through which his own heart passed. It wasn't the gesture of an exemplary father. It was a man unlearning his temper to become human. Outside, the rumors continued. Inside, a new silence took shape. The housekeeper, with the discretion of someone who knows. Both sides of the world left a transparent envelope on the office desk with timetables. Arrows indicating the minutes when the pantry turned on by itself, small notes about the boss's urgent call in the early morning, an underline during the break when all the cameras failed. The millionaire ran his finger along the pen lines and felt the same texture as his son's drawing, lines that, when added together, formed a person, not a script. He sat down, opened his wallet, and spread out the saved napkins, the borrowed string medal, the flash drive with incomplete passages. The office, which had always known numbers, had to learn the language of the essential. One windy night, the boy woke with a start and ran into the hallway. His father found him at the window, boat in hand, and heard that prayer without saints. She said we breathed together. The man knelt, pressed his forehead against her small forehead, and breathed in unison, as if discovering that the body is also a bridge. When the boy fell asleep, he stood watching the red light of the camera blink, faithful as a beacon. He finally understood that there were 2 hungers in that house, the son's hunger for truth and his wife's hunger for appearances. One feeds, the other poisons. The next day he entered the security room unannounced. He no longer apologized to anyone for being alive. He requested access, copies, logs. He cross-referenced schedules with the housekeeper's map, the boy's drawings, and his wife's. Precise memory of every gesture in the living room. The pieces fell into place with a painful slap. The doubt, which had served as his alibi for so long, became a certainty with an address. As he left, he stared at the pantry like someone looking at an empty stage after a show and realizing that beneath the gilding there had always been dust. Back in her son's room, she found a new note scrawled on his pillow. Courage remembers how to breathe. She took the paper, tucked it into her jacket, and knew the boy's heart had done the work he had cowardly put off. That sentence would be her script when the lights in the room went out again and everyone had to watch what the cameras patiently saved for the right moment. Doubt had ended its journey. The father who ties shoelaces like the ones she taught him, the man who avoids looking at his own omission, and the owner of a surname that carries weight, the 3, finally, breathed in unison. And from now on, each breath would push the story toward the truth. That morning, the millionaire not only donned the impeccable suit he always wore, he also donned a decisive stance. He walked through the mansion's corridors with a different, resonant step, as if the marble had finally recognized a new weight. The security chief awaited him with the same rehearsed speech as always, corrupted files, technical failures, but this time his voice hit a wall. "I want it all, now, uncut." His dry tone left no room for hesitation. Hours of recordings. On flash drives and printed reports were delivered. In the office, he locked the door, closed the curtains, and prepared to face what he already knew in silence. The images flashed before his eyes, employees clearing trays, guests saying goodbye, the room emptying, until suddenly the minutes jumped. The screen showed 11:45 p.m., and in the next frame it was 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes swallowed by nothingness. He repeated, paused, fast-forwarded, rewinded, always the same gap. The early hours of the morning wore on, and at 12:03 a.m. the pantry camera recorded the movement. The light flicked on, and a figure entered quickly. The face wasn't visible, but the posture, the way she held her hair, the calculated walk, nothing resembled the maid. The millionaire's blood ran cold when the hand appeared in close-up. There was the giant, unmistakable ring, the same one his wife had sported at the party, commented on, and praised by everyone. The reflection of the stone shone like a betrayal. Paused the video, brought the frame closer, and stared at the image until his heart pounded in his temples. There was no denying it anymore. It wasn't a suspicion, but a certainty. His wife had set up the whole ruse, planted the jewel, and prepared the spectacle. And he, with his silence, had been complicit in the injustice. The millionaire closed his eyes, put his hands to his face, and for the first time in years, felt ashamed not of failing in business, but of failing as a man. He remembered his son kneeling on the floor saying, "She didn't do anything," and the dignity of the maid who, even humiliated, had refused to sign a lie. Each scene came back to him with force, as if fate were rubbing in his face everything he had tried to ignore. He called the security chief again. "Prepare copies of these recordings, all of them, and keep the originals where no one else can touch them." The order sounded like a sentence. The man, hesitant, obeyed. He knew that from that point on, there was no turning back. That night, the millionaire descended into the empty ballroom. He walked between the tables, the dimmed chandeliers reflecting his own shadow. He stopped before the same table where his wife, in front of everyone, had staged the discovery of the theft. He felt anger rise like fire, but also something different, a determination he had never known. He knew he had to expose the truth, and not in secret, but before the very eyes that had witnessed the lie. The mansion, which had long been a stage for luxury and arrogance, would soon become a courtroom. And when the images were shown, it wouldn't just be the maid's innocence that would be restored, it would be the wife's downfall before her own empire of vanity. The next morning, the millionaire descended to his office with the flash drive in his hands, as if carrying an invisible weight. There was no more room for excuses or delays. The truth needed to be seen. He called 2 close advisors, the housekeeper and the head of security. He requested absolute silence and projected the images onto the large screen in the meeting room. The room, always used to discussing profits and contracts, now became the stage for something much larger. The opening scenes showed the party in full swing. Guests dancing, servants serving, the mistress circling like a queen in her own empire. Then the clock ticked forward, and everyone watched the hall empty. Until the fateful hour appeared, 11:58 p.m. The pantry camera flickered on and a female silhouette appeared. Her posture was erect, her hair held, her walk confidently. There was no doubt. It wasn't the maid. The millionaire paused the video for a moment, looking at each person present. "Watch carefully," he said firmly. He pressed play again. The figure calmly handled the boxes, removed the bracelet from his pocket, and hid it among the groceries. When he raised his hand to turn off the light, the definitive proof shone. His wife's gigantic ring gleamed. Under the lamp, the same jewel everyone had seen on her finger that night. The room fell silent. The security chief lowered his eyes, the housekeeper put her hand to her mouth to contain her emotion, and the advisors looked at each other, aware that this was changing everything. The recording continued until it showed the mistress calmly leaving the pantry, adjusting her dress before returning to the hall as if nothing had happened. Hours later, she would stage the fake discovery in front of everyone. The millionaire paused the scene and left the image frozen on the screen, his wife at the exact moment she was setting up the hoax. He walked to the window, took a deep breath, and turned to the audience. All this time, an innocent woman was humiliated. We all believed the lie because it was convenient, but the truth always finds its way. His words echoed like a gavel in a courtroom. The housekeeper wept quietly, not from sadness, but from relief. The head of security, embarrassed, apologized for having obeyed orders and admitted that he had noticed the flaws from the beginning. The advisors simply nodded, with the gravity of those who knew that the revelation would shake not only the house, but the reputation of the entire family. Meanwhile, in a simple room at the boarding house, the maid was still discreetly wiping away the tears from another night of silence. She had no idea that, at that very moment, her innocence was already being proven irrefutable. The lie that had crushed her was now being turned against the one who planted it. The millionaire turned off the screen and said firmly, "We won't keep this a secret. It will be shown to everyone, just as the theatre of lies was shown." The sentence sounded like a final sentence. His wife's mask was about to fall, and not in silence but in front of the very people who had applauded her performance. The mansion had been summoned as the stage for a settling of scores. Guests, close friends, advisors, and even some staff were summoned to the main hall under the guise of a security meeting. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, as if everyone sensed something major was about to happen. The boss, impeccable in a red dress that reflected her practiced confidence, sat at the front surrounded by knowing glances. He still believed he was in control of the narrative. The millionaire descended the stairs silently, holding a small remote control. There were no introductory speeches, just the gravity of his voice. "In recent days, our house has been filled with rumors and accusations. Today, everyone will see the truth." The lights dimmed, the projector flickered on, and the first images appeared. At first, the scenes were ordinary. A packed room, employees milling about, guests laughing, music playing in the background. But then came the long-awaited moment. The pantry camera flickered on at 11:58 p.m., and a female silhouette entered. The silence that filled the room was absolute. Every detail spoke volumes: the way she walked, the way she adjusted her hair, the calculated gesture of hiding the bracelet among the boxes. And then, the decisive close-up, the giant ring glinting in the light, the same one everyone there had seen shining on the boss's finger that night. Some guests' eyes widened, others clapped their hands over their mouths in shock. The wife's friends exchanged nervous glances. The mistress tried to maintain her smile, but the mask began to crack. "Set up!" she shouted, standing up suddenly. Her voice, which had always dominated the room, sounded shaky and desperate. The millionaire paused the image and looked at each person present. "Here's the proof. The bracelet was never stolen. It was planted." The weight of his words reverberated in the room like a judge's gavel. The housekeeper wept silently. The servants looked at each other with suppressed relief, and his son, sitting in the back, suddenly stood up. He walked to the front and, in a firm voice, said, "She never lied." He pointed to the maid, who had been called at the last minute, and now entered the room with hesitant steps, not understanding why she had been summoned. The frozen image on the screen showed the employer in the act. The contrast was stark. On one side, the woman adorned in luxury exposed by her own lie. On the other, the maid in a simple uniform, carrying in her eyes the strength of someone who resisted in silence. The entire room realized that true greatness was never in the employer's brilliance, but in the dignity of the young woman who refused to yield. The desperate wife still tried to speak. "I did it for the good of the family," she justified herself, but her voice echoed hollowly. The guests no longer listened. The weight of the images had spoken louder than any words. One by one, the gazes that had once flattered her now withdrew, as if her presence were contagious. The room no longer saw her as a hostess, but as an impostor. The millionaire, for the first time, publicly sided with the truth. He walked up to the maid, handed her the string medal his son had kept, and declared before everyone, she was the only one who remained whole. The gesture drew murmurs and sighs. His employer, exhausted, collapsed in her chair, her impeccable makeup streaming down in tears that no longer had an audience to console. The mansion, once a showcase of luxury, was now a courthouse. And, in front of everyone, the wife lost what she cherished most: the image that supported her invisible crown. The silence that gripped the hall was too heavy to be broken by any words. The mistress, once the absolute mistress of the mansion, remained slumped in her chair, trying to regain her lost posture. The red dress, once a symbol of power, seemed to suffocate her. The guests who until minutes before had been drinking in her arrogance now avoided her as if the mere touch were compromising. The mask she had worn for so long had finally slipped, and no amount of makeup could hide it. The maid remained motionless, still in disbelief at what had just happened. In her hands, the string medal trembled like a piece of eternity. What had begun as a childish gesture now symbolized her redemption before everyone. Her son approached, hugging her tightly, and repeated aloud, "I knew you hadn't done anything." The phrase echoed through the room, as simple as it was devastating. Every guest who heard it understood that, in the mouth of a child, the truth sounded purer than any adult justification. The millionaire, firm and serene, looked at his wife. "The lie you've built has not only destroyed this house, but the trust of everyone who believed in you. I can't stand this anymore." His words came not in shouts, but with finality. The weight of the ensuing silence was greater than any scandal. His wife tried to respond, but her voice faltered. Her friends discreetly gathered their bags and disappeared from the living room, leaving her alone in the void she had created for herself. The next day, the news had already spread. The same people who had repeated their boss's venomous version were now whispering about her downfall. Columnists wrote that the shine of gold did not hide the shadow of lies, and business people began discreetly withdrawing from her social invitations. The rumor she herself had sown became the scythe that cut through her invisible crown. It was karma working silently, returning everything in kind, but multiplied. The maid, for her part, didn't demand revenge. She continued working that night as if nothing had happened. She collected glasses, arranged chairs, and put away tablecloths. But there was something different in her demeanor. She no longer carried the weight of imposed shame, but rather the lightness of acknowledged innocence. Her employer's haughty gaze no longer reached her. The humiliation that had once wounded her was now just dust on the floor she herself helped keep clean. Days later, the millionaire sought her out in the garden. The wind was blowing lightly, and the boy ran with the plastic boat in his hands. "You have a place here, if you want to stay," the man said, with the sincerity of someone who no longer hid his feelings. She looked at him, eyes firm, and replied, "My place is where dignity is not negotiated." She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She simply left in the air the certainty that her life would no longer be guided by humiliation, but by her own choices. The millionaire smiled, understanding that true love is not born of possession, but of respect. The mistress, now isolated, began to walk the halls of the mansion like a shadow. No one feared her anymore, no one applauded her anymore. The luxury that surrounded her no longer reflected anything but her own solitude. Deep down, she herself began to realize that she had lost what mattered most to her, her audience. The greatest punishment was not losing her husband or her position, but being forced to face her own reflection without the applause that had always sustained her. And so the wheel of fate completed its turn. The woman who had been humiliated in front of everyone walked away with her head held high. The wife she had humiliated now bowed under the weight of her own lie. The boy continued to follow her with tender glances, and the millionaire, still bound by convention, silently discovered that true love is built on what cannot be bought. On the last night before leaving the mansion, the maid walked alone to the living room. She placed the string medal on the shelf where the lie had been planted and whispered, "This ends." She left without looking back. The red camera blinked as if confirming the recording. Outside, the sky opened up a crack of stars, and she felt the wind as if breathing freedom for the first time. The boy from the window waved with the little boat in his hands, and the millionaire silently watched the scene, knowing that this departure wasn't a loss, but justice. Because some stories don't end in golden castles, but in the simple gesture of someone who finally finds their own voice. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on how fate returns everything in its own time, please like and subscribe to the channel. Here you'll always find intense, emotional, and twist-filled stories that show that the truth never remains silent. Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what impacted you most on this journey. And get ready, because the next chapter could be even more surprising.